For centuries, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the most powerful and enduring empires in history. Stretching across 3 continents, it commanded vast territories, controlled key trade routes, and influenced the culture, politics, and economies of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Armies marched, fleets sailed, and cities thrived under its authority. Yet despite its external strength, the empire eventually crumbled. History often emphasizes the pressures from rival powers, wars, and foreign invasions, but a closer look reveals a different truth. The empire's decline was driven less by enemies and more by internal corruption, mismanagement, and systemic decay. At its height, the Ottoman Empire was a model of organization, administration, and military efficiency. Sultans commanded loyalty from provincial governors, collected taxes, maintained armies, and oversaw trade. Merchants, scholars, and artisans flourished, and cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Baghdad became centers of commerce, culture, and learning. The legal system, rooted in both Islamic law and administrative codes, ensured relative stability, and merit-based appointments allowed capable leaders to rise through the ranks. This combination of centralized authority and local autonomy allowed the empire to manage vast and diverse territories for centuries. However, over time, cracks began to appear. The empire's administrative machinery, once efficient, started to falter. Provincial governors increasingly acted as semi-independent rulers, exploiting local populations and diverting revenue to their own coffers. Reports from contemporary observers note that tax collection became inconsistent, and officials often accepted bribes to maintain their positions or avoid punishment. Corruption eroded public trust and weakened the state's ability to govern effectively. An empire built on loyalty and discipline began to struggle under its own inefficiencies. The military, another pillar of Ottoman power, also suffered from internal decay. Elite units, such as the Janissaries, once loyal and disciplined, became politicized and resistant to reform. Instead of serving as a professional army, many soldiers sought personal gain, selling positions, accepting bribes, and resisting modernization efforts. Generals and commanders who lacked skill were sometimes promoted due to favoritism or connections rather than merit. The result was a military increasingly incapable of responding effectively to new threats, while discipline and morale deteriorated. As internal corruption grew, even minor external challenges became harder to manage. Economic mismanagement further compounded the problem. The empire's economy relied heavily on agriculture, trade, and taxation. However, corrupt officials often misappropriated funds and extracted excessive taxes, placing a heavy burden on peasants and merchants. Trade routes that once flowed with wealth became increasingly difficult to control due to inefficiency and favoritism. Inflation, debasement of currency, and mismanagement of resources weakened the financial base of the state. Without sound economic foundations, the empire could not sustain large armies, maintain infrastructure, or support public institutions. Corruption also extended to the judicial and bureaucratic systems. Laws were often applied selectively, favoring those with wealth, influence, or connections. Officials sold positions in the bureaucracy, ensuring that the most capable administrators were sidelined in favor of the well-connected. Complaints from citizens and provincial authorities were frequently ignored or manipulated for personal advantage. This systemic decay undermined the legitimacy of the state, making it harder to enforce policies or maintain order across distant provinces. Religious and social institutions, once sources of unity and moral authority, were also affected. Religious leaders, who had historically helped mediate disputes and maintain social cohesion, increasingly became involved in political maneuvering or accepted gifts and favors to support certain officials. Social inequality grew as elites enriched themselves at the expense of the general population. Tensions between ethnic and religious communities, once managed through careful administration, began to rise, further straining the empire's cohesion. Attempts at reform were often blocked or undermined by the very individuals whose corruption had weakened the empire. Well-intentioned sultans tried to modernize the army, restructure the administration, and stabilize the economy, but resistance from entrenched interests, janissaries, provincial governors, and wealthy elites made meaningful change difficult. Reformers faced obstruction, and in many cases, efforts to centralize authority or enforce discipline only intensified resistance. This internal conflict drained resources, divided the leadership, and allowed inefficiency to flourish unchecked. The impact of corruption on foreign relations was also significant. European powers, while often seen as the empire's main rivals, frequently took advantage not through direct conquest but through manipulation of Ottoman internal weaknesses. Diplomatic treaties, loans, and trade agreements were often negotiated with officials more interested in personal gain than state interests. Corruption undermined coherent foreign policy, leaving the empire vulnerable to economic exploitation and diplomatic pressure. While enemies were present, it was the empire's internal failings that truly weakened its ability to respond. Cultural and intellectual stagnation also played a role. Patronage of the arts, science, and education declined as resources were diverted to private enrichment rather than public benefit. Innovation slowed, universities and madrasas received less support, and talented individuals were overlooked or forced to seek opportunities elsewhere. Over time, this diminished the empire's ability to compete intellectually and culturally with emerging European powers, who were undergoing industrial and scientific revolutions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the cumulative effects of corruption became impossible to ignore. Provinces drifted toward autonomy, armies were less reliable, and the treasury was consistently in deficit. The central government struggled to enforce laws or maintain authority, creating opportunities for rebellion and unrest. While wars with Russia, Austria, and other neighbors tested the empire externally, these conflicts often only exposed the weaknesses created internally. Each defeat, negotiation, or territorial loss highlighted the underlying problem. It was not foreign enemies alone that threatened the empire, but its own internal dysfunction. Historians now emphasize that the Ottoman decline was gradual and systemic. Unlike a sudden collapse caused by conquest, the empire slowly lost the cohesion, efficiency, and legitimacy that had allowed it to thrive. Corruption permeated every level of administration, military, and society, creating a situation where even minor challenges could escalate into crises. The empire remained powerful in appearance, but its internal rot had hollowed out its foundation. Efforts to modernize in the 19th century, known as the Tanzimat reforms, sought to address corruption, centralize authority, and introduce legal and administrative reforms. While these initiatives showed promise, they often faced entrenched opposition. Wealthy elites, local power brokers, and traditional military units resisted reforms, fearing loss of privilege. As a result, the reforms were only partially successful, and the empire continued to weaken from within, even as it struggled to navigate external pressures. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had become known as the sick man of Europe. Its armies were no longer capable of defending distant territories effectively, its economy was dependent on foreign loans, and its political institutions were riddled with corruption. While European powers had long watched its decline, it was the empire's internal weaknesses that truly sealed its fate. When World War I erupted, the Ottoman state could not sustain the demands of modern warfare, and its eventual defeat and partition reflected centuries of accumulated internal failure, rather than a single external conquest. Today, the story of the Ottoman Empire's decline serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of internal corruption. Military strength, territorial expansion, and diplomatic skill can only sustain a state for so long if the foundations of governance, law, and social equity are undermined. The empire's history demonstrates that true resilience depends not only on power, but also on integrity, accountability, and effective administration. It fell not because enemies surrounded it, but because the strength within was eroded over time. The legacy of this decline is visible in the remnants of the empire's territories, cities, and institutions. Scholars study its history not only to understand its military and political achievements, but also to learn lessons about governance reform and the consequences of systemic corruption. The Ottoman Empire reminds the world that empires are fragile when internal decay takes root, no matter how formidable they may appear from the outside. In conclusion, the fall of the Ottoman Empire cannot be fully explained by wars, invasions, or rival powers. While external pressures existed, the deeper cause lay within: pervasive corruption, administrative decay, and mismanagement that slowly undermined every level of governance. From the treasury to the army, from provincial officials to central administrators, corruption sapped the empire's strength and left it unable to respond effectively to new challenges. The Ottoman experience serves as both a cautionary tale and a historical lesson. An empire's greatest threat often lies not in the armies at its borders, but in the integrity of its own institutions.